Deep in the Kentucky mountains of 1878, where coal dust settles like secrets and isolation breeds unspeakable acts, there existed a place called Blackstone Hollow. Here, among families who survived on mining and prayer, one man controlled everything: the land, the mine, the store, even Sunday sermons. Josiah Blackwood was the kind of man neighbors trusted with their lives and their souls. But behind the closed doors of his mountain estate, this Methodist preacher was orchestrating horrors that would make seasoned investigators refuse to speak of them for decades. The story I'm about to tell involves a desperate wife, a reluctant brother, and a twisted obsession that destroyed multiple lives. What drove a respected community leader to such unspeakable acts? What evidence finally exposed the truth that had been buried in mountain silence? And how was justice ultimately served to a man who believed God himself had sanctioned his crimes? Prepare yourself for what's coming next, because what you're about to discover will test everything you thought you knew about evil hiding behind righteousness. Subscribe to stand with those who expose buried truth, and comment your city and time. We're fascinated where these documented accounts reach. The rope creaked in the March wind of 1880 as Josiah Blackwood mounted the gallows platform, his Methodist preacher's composure finally cracking under the weight of 200 mountain voices chanting, "Justice for Tabitha! Justice for Tabitha!" Sheriff Coleman Brantley's hand rested on the lever that would end the life of a man who had once baptized half the children in Morgan County, Kentucky. But the documented evidence sealed in the courthouse vault told a story so disturbing that 3 jurors had requested medical attention during testimony, and the presiding judge had declared it an abomination that defies Christian comprehension. 2 years earlier, in the autumn of 1878, Blackstone Hollow appeared to be nothing more than a thriving coal mining settlement nestled deep in the Kentucky mountains, where 300 souls survived on timber, mining, and the kind of fierce independence that kept government interference at bay. The Blackwood family name commanded respect throughout the hollow and beyond, controlling 800 acres of mineral-rich territory that employed half the men in the settlement and extended credit to most families through their company store. Josiah Blackwood, at 34, stood as the undisputed patriarch of this mountain community, delivering Sunday sermons with the same authority he used to manage mine operations and settle land disputes. Court records from the Morgan County Clerk's office reveal that Josiah possessed an unusual education for a mountain man, having completed 8th grade and maintained extensive correspondence with legal experts in Lexington regarding mineral rights and inheritance law. His knowledge of Kentucky, statutes governing property transfer, and bloodline succession would later prove central to understanding his twisted motivations, as documented in Sheriff Brantley's investigation files that filled 4 leather-bound volumes by the trial's conclusion. Neighbors consistently described him as a man who feared God and demanded respect, unaware that his memorized Bible passages and stern sermons about moral duty concealed a mind capable of justifying unspeakable acts through religious interpretation. The first crack in this carefully constructed facade appeared in the Hollow Cemetery, where a weathered headstone marked the grave of Mary Campbell Blackwood, Josiah's first wife, who had allegedly died in childbirth 6 years earlier. But when old-timer Samuel Hutchins mentioned to Sheriff Brantley that he had never seen an infant's burial, the lawman's military-trained instincts detected something amiss in the official story. Church records maintained by Reverend Silas Morton showed Mary's death certificate listing complications of childbirth as cause of death, yet no corresponding infant burial appeared in the parish registry, creating the first documented inconsistency in what would become a mountain of evidence against Josiah Blackwood. Mary's death had cleared the way for Josiah's marriage to Tabitha Morrison in 1874, a union arranged by her financially desperate father to settle debts accumulated during the Panic of 1873. The 20-year-old city girl from Lexington had arrived in Blackstone Hollow with trunks full of books and refined manners that initially charmed the mountain community, but 4 years of marriage had produced no children, creating whispered speculation in a culture where fertility determined a woman's worth. Dr. Ephraim Cross's medical records, seized during the investigation, documented increasingly frequent visits to the Blackwood household beginning in 1877, with cryptic notations about patient distress and suspicious injuries requiring discretion. The doctor's journal entries, written in the careful handwriting of a Jefferson Medical College graduate, revealed growing concern about Tabitha's condition through coded language that protected patient confidentiality while documenting evidence of systematic abuse. Patient exhibits contusions inconsistent with household accidents, read one entry dated November 1878, followed by increasingly disturbing observations about psychological trauma manifesting in physical symptoms, and patient's fear prevents honest medical history. These medical records would later provide crucial corroboration for testimony that shocked the courtroom into stunned silence, establishing a timeline of escalating violence that culminated in multiple murders. Meanwhile, Caleb Blackwood's behavior had begun attracting attention from bartender Thomas Mackenzie, whose establishment served as the Hollow's unofficial gathering place for men seeking refuge from the harsh realities of mining life. Court testimony revealed that Caleb's previously gentle demeanor had transformed into something darker, marked by increasing alcohol consumption and disturbing confessions that Mackenzie initially dismissed as drunken ramblings. He kept saying Josiah was making him do ungodly things, Mackenzie testified under oath, and that he couldn't face God knowing what he'd done to that poor woman. The bartender's detailed recollections provided prosecutors with specific dates and witnesses to Caleb's deteriorating mental state, establishing a timeline that perfectly aligned with other evidence. The servants who worked in the Blackwood household possessed the most intimate knowledge of the family's private moments, yet their social position as hired help initially prevented them from speaking about the horrors they witnessed daily. Ada Pruitt, the 28-year-old kitchen servant whose family had remained in Kentucky after emancipation, occupied a unique position that gave her access to family secrets, while her race made her testimony particularly dangerous in a community where challenging white authority could prove fatal. Sheriff Brantley's investigation notes reveal that Ada had been secretly documenting evidence for months, collecting blood-stained sheets and torn clothing while maintaining detailed mental records of conversations and violent incidents. The investigation files contain Ada's sworn statement describing how she had observed Tabitha's increasing withdrawal from community activities, noting bruises that appeared with suspicious regularity and always coincided with Dr. Cross's emergency visits to the household. Mrs. Tabitha stopped attending church socials and stopped helping with the sick, Ada testified, and when she did appear in public, she wore long sleeves even in summer heat, keeping her eyes down like she was carrying shame that wasn't rightfully hers. These behavioral changes, documented by multiple witnesses, established a pattern of isolation and control that prosecutors used to demonstrate Josiah's systematic destruction of his wife's support networks. But it was on a cold November evening in 1878 that Ada Pruitt witnessed something through the Blackwood house's kitchen window that would forever change her understanding of evil's capacity to hide behind respectability. Court transcripts record her testimony with clinical precision, despite the obvious trauma evident in her voice. "I saw what the Lord never intended any human soul to witness, and I knew right then that somebody had to speak for Mrs. Tabitha because she couldn't speak for herself no more." The specific details of what Ada observed that night remained sealed in the court record, deemed too disturbing for public consumption, but her testimony provided the crucial eyewitness evidence that transformed suspicion into prosecutable fact. Sheriff Brantley's subsequent investigation would uncover a web of violence, coercion, and murder that stretched back years, involving not just Josiah and his terrified wife, but multiple victims whose deaths had been carefully disguised as accidents or natural causes. The evidence collected from that November night forward would fill courtroom exhibits and ensure that justice, long delayed, would finally reach the isolated mountain hollow where evil had flourished in the shadow of false righteousness. Dr. Ephraim Cross had delivered over 300 babies and treated countless injuries during his 13 years serving the Kentucky mountain communities. But the bruises on Tabitha Blackwood's throat in December 1878 defied any medical explanation he could record in polite company. His leather-bound journal, later seized as evidence by Sheriff Brantley, contained increasingly disturbing entries written in the careful Latin terminology that allowed him to document horrors while maintaining professional discretion. Patient exhibits ligature marks consistent with manual strangulation, he wrote on December 15th. Defensive wounds on forearms suggest prolonged struggle. Psychological state indicates severe ongoing trauma. The 52-year-old physician's training at Jefferson Medical College had prepared him for the harsh realities of frontier medicine, but nothing in his education had equipped him to handle the systematic documentation of what appeared to be deliberate torture masquerading as domestic discipline. Court records reveal that Dr. Cross began maintaining 2 separate medical files for Tabitha Blackwood, one containing routine notations suitable for family review, and another hidden volume that recorded the true extent of her injuries with photographic precision. This second journal, discovered behind loose floorboards in his study after his death, contained detailed sketches of bite marks, burn patterns, and internal injuries that prosecutors would later use to establish the prolonged nature of her suffering. Each visit to the Blackwood household revealed new evidence of escalating violence, carefully hidden beneath long sleeves and high necklines that had become Tabitha's daily uniform of concealment. Dr. Cross's medical notes from January 18, 1979 documented extensive bruising to ribs and torso. Patient reports difficulty breathing, refuses to explain cause of injuries beyond household accident. His growing suspicion that these injuries resulted from deliberate assault rather than mishaps led him to begin timing his visits to coincide with Josiah's absence from the property, hoping to encourage honest disclosure from a woman clearly terrified of her husband's retaliation. But it was during a February visit that Dr. Cross discovered evidence that transformed his medical suspicions into moral certainty. When Tabitha finally revealed the existence of her hidden diary and begged him to read entries that documented 18 months of systematic abuse. The physician's journal entry for February 20th captured his horror. Patient provided written account of forced intimate relations with husband's brother, detailed threats of violence, and documentation of previous suspicious death. Content too disturbing for medical record, evidence secured for potential legal proceedings. This diary, written in Tabitha's educated hand and hidden in the root cellar beneath preserving jars, would later become the prosecution's most damaging evidence against Josiah Blackwood. Meanwhile, Ada Pruitt had transformed from loyal household servant into meticulous evidence collector, driven by witnessing acts that violated every moral principle she held sacred. Sheriff Brantley's investigation files reveal that Ada had been systematically gathering physical proof of the abuse, hiding blood-stained bedsheets in the smokehouse, preserving torn undergarments in her personal trunk, and maintaining careful mental notes of conversations and violent incidents. Her sworn affidavit, taken after Dr. Cross's death, described finding Tabitha unconscious in the kitchen with a head wound that Josiah claimed resulted from a dizzy spell and unfortunate fall, though the blood spatter pattern on the wall suggested deliberate assault with a blunt instrument. The servant's position in the household granted her access to family correspondence and private conversations that revealed the true scope of Josiah's obsession with producing an heir to secure the Blackwood mineral rights inheritance. Court testimony showed that Ada had overheard Josiah consulting with Lexington attorneys about Kentucky laws governing property transfer to illegitimate children, discovering his legal research into whether offspring produced through his wife and brother could legally inherit his land holdings. These conversations, documented in Ada's meticulous memory and later corroborated by attorney records, established the twisted logic behind Josiah's systematic abuse campaign. Dr. Cross's attempts to intervene medically had led him to research treatments for what he privately diagnosed as severe psychological trauma, corresponding with colleagues in Louisville and Philadelphia about therapeutic approaches for victims of prolonged domestic violence. His letters, found in his medical bag after his death, revealed growing desperation as Tabitha's condition deteriorated despite his medical interventions. Patient exhibits all symptoms of profound psychological break, he wrote to Dr. Marcus Webb in Louisville, caused by systematic torture that continues despite my repeated warnings to cease harmful behaviors. Legal intervention may be only remaining option to prevent permanent mental damage or death. The physician's decision to confront Josiah directly came after discovering evidence that the abuse had expanded beyond physical violence into something far more sinister, involving Caleb Blackwood in acts that Dr. Cross described in coded medical terminology as forced conjugal relations designed to circumvent natural fertility limitations. His journal entry for March 10, 1879, recorded his intention to address patient's husband regarding cessation of harmful behaviors, with legal action threatened if medical recommendations ignored. This confrontation, witnessed by Ada Pruitt from the kitchen window, resulted in Josiah's explicit threats against Dr. Cross's family and medical practice, establishing clear motive for the physician's subsequent murder. Court records reveal that Dr. Cross spent his final weeks documenting every piece of evidence he had gathered, creating multiple copies of his hidden medical files, and arranging for their secure storage in the event of his death or disappearance. His correspondence with Sheriff Brantley, initiated just days before his murder, contained carefully worded requests for legal advice regarding a medical situation requiring potential law enforcement intervention to prevent further harm to a patient. The sheriff's response, agreeing to meet with Dr. Cross on October 21st to discuss matters of mutual concern regarding patient welfare, arrived at the physician's home the morning after his body was discovered. The official cause of death, recorded by the county coroner as sudden cardiac failure consistent with natural causes, satisfied local authorities initially reluctant to investigate the death of a man known for discretion and professional integrity. But Sheriff Brantley's examination of the death scene revealed details that contradicted the peaceful passing suggested by heart failure, including overturned furniture, defensive wounds on the victim's hands, and signs of struggle that indicated Dr. Cross had fought desperately against his attacker. The sheriff's investigation notes described finding the physician's hidden medical files scattered across his study floor, with specific pages documenting Tabitha's injuries torn out and burned in the fireplace. Most damning was the discovery of a threatening letter in Josiah's handwriting, found beneath Dr. Cross's desk, where it had fallen during the struggle, containing explicit warnings about interfering in family matters that don't concern outsiders, and promises that those who spread lies about God-fearing men will face consequences both earthly and eternal. This letter, written on Blackwood Company store letterhead and bearing Josiah's distinctive signature, provided the crucial link between the respected mine foreman and the physician's violent death. Sheriff Brantley's decision to formally open a murder investigation into Dr. Cross's death would finally bring the full weight of the law against the man who believed his wealth and position placed him above justice. The evidence gathered by Dr. Cross and Ada Pruitt would prove essential to the prosecution's case, but their courage in documenting horrors that others preferred to ignore had cost the physician his life and placed the servant in mortal danger. Justice for Tabitha Blackwood would require not only exposing her husband's crimes, but also ensuring that those who had died trying to protect her had not sacrificed their lives in vain. Sheriff Coleman Brantley's military-trained investigative instincts, honed during years of exposing Confederate spy networks, recognized that Dr. Cross's murder represented only the visible surface of a conspiracy that extended deep into the foundations of Blackstone Hollow's social structure. His systematic interviews with mine workers, beginning in late October 1879, revealed a community paralyzed by economic dependence on the Blackwood family and terrorized by a pattern of suspicious deaths that had eliminated anyone who dared question Josiah's authority. Court records show that Brantley conducted 43 separate interviews over 6 weeks, carefully documenting testimonies that painted a portrait of systematic intimidation disguised as natural accidents and unfortunate coincidences. The sheriff's investigation files reveal that 3 miners who had previously complained about unsafe working conditions in the Blackwood mine had died in separate incidents during 1878, each death officially ruled accidental, despite evidence suggesting deliberate sabotage. Timothy Walsh, who had threatened to report dangerous gas buildups to state mining inspectors, was found crushed beneath a collapsed support beam that showed clear signs of deliberate weakening. Samuel Garrett, who had organized workers to demand better pay, died from what appeared to be methane poisoning in a section of the mine that had tested safe just hours earlier. Most disturbing was the death of Martin Hensley, who had witnessed Josiah striking Tabitha outside the company store and had mentioned the incident to other workers. Found at the bottom of a mine shaft with injuries consistent with being pushed rather than falling accidentally. Brantley's interviews with the miners' widows uncovered a reign of terror that extended far beyond workplace retaliation, revealing how Josiah used economic coercion to ensure silence about his family's private affairs. The sheriff's notes document how families who had spoken critically of the Blackwoods suddenly found their credit cut off at the company store, their employment terminated without explanation, and their homes threatened with foreclosure on debts that had previously been considered manageable. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh testified that after her husband's death, Josiah had personally visited her home to express condolences while simultaneously threatening to evict her and her 4 children if she continued spreading lies about accidents that were clearly God's will. The breakthrough in the investigation came when Sheriff Brantley gained the trust of Thomas Mackenzie, the saloon owner whose establishment served as the Hollow's unofficial center for male, social interaction and whose position behind the bar had made him privy to years of drunken confessions and unguarded conversations. Mackenzie's sworn testimony, recorded in the sheriff's investigation files, revealed that Caleb Blackwood's alcohol consumption had increased dramatically over the previous 18 months, accompanied by increasingly disturbing admissions about ungodly acts that Josiah had forced him to commit. Court records show that Mackenzie had maintained mental notes of these conversations, providing prosecutors with specific dates and witnesses that corroborated other evidence in the case. Caleb kept saying that Josiah was making him do things that would send him straight to hell, Mackenzie testified, and that he was trapped because Josiah controlled his livelihood and threatened to cast him out with nothing if he refused to participate in what he called family duty. The bartender's detailed recollections included Caleb's specific descriptions of being forced to engage in intimate relations with Tabitha while Josiah watched and directed the encounters, creating evidence that established both the systematic nature of the abuse and Caleb's reluctant participation under extreme duress. These testimonies, recorded in Sheriff Brantley's meticulous handwriting, provided crucial corroboration for the physical evidence that would soon be discovered. The most damaging evidence emerged when Ada Pruitt, emboldened by Sheriff Brantley's promise of protection, revealed the location of Tabitha's complete diary hidden in a mason jar buried beneath preserving supplies in the Blackwood household's root cellar. This leather-bound journal, written in Tabitha's educated hand over 18 months, contained day-by-day documentation of the systematic abuse she had endured, including detailed accounts of forced encounters with Caleb, explicit threats of violence from Josiah, and her growing desperation as escape seemed impossible. Court transcripts reveal that portions of this diary were deemed too explicit for public reading, though the prosecution was permitted to introduce specific entries as evidence of premeditated conspiracy and systematic torture. The diary entries, beginning in March 1878, chronicled Tabitha's initial confusion and horror as Josiah began implementing his plan to produce an heir through his brother, documenting his justification that God's law requires bloodline continuation by any means necessary when a wife fails in her sacred duty. Later entries revealed the escalation of violence when Tabitha attempted to resist, including detailed descriptions of beatings, threats against her life, and Josiah's promises to kill her and dispose of her body in the mine if she attempted to seek help or escape. Most chilling were the final entries from September 1879, where Tabitha wrote of her belief that Josiah planned to murder her regardless of whether she became pregnant, having grown tired of maintaining the pretense of marriage. Sheriff Brantley's investigation expanded to examine the circumstances surrounding previous deaths in the Hollow, revealing a pattern of violence that stretched back years and encompassed anyone who had posed a threat to Josiah's control over the community. Court records show that the sheriff requested exhumation orders for 5 individuals whose deaths had been attributed to natural causes or accidents, including Josiah's first wife, Mary, whose remains revealed skull fractures consistent with blunt force trauma rather than complications of childbirth. These forensic examinations, conducted by state medical experts, provided crucial evidence that Josiah's violence against Tabitha represented continuation of a long-established pattern rather than isolated incidents of domestic discord. The investigation took a tragic turn in early November 1879 when Caleb Blackwood was found dead at the bottom of the main mine shaft, his body discovered by workers beginning the morning shift. The official ruling of accidental death seemed plausible given the dangerous nature of mine work, but Sheriff Brantley's examination of the scene revealed suspicious details that suggested suicide rather than mishap. Most significantly, Caleb's coat contained a sealed letter addressed "To whoever finds this," written in his distinctive handwriting and providing a full confession of his involvement in the systematic abuse of Tabitha under Josiah's coercion and threats. Caleb's confession letter, entered as evidence in the murder trial, contained explicit admissions of guilt accompanied by detailed explanations of how Josiah had manipulated him into participating in acts that violated every moral principle he held sacred. "My brother told me it was my Christian duty to help produce a Blackwood heir," the letter stated, "and that if I refused, he would cast me off the land with nothing, and tell everyone in the Hollow that I was a coward who abandoned family when they needed him most." The letter went on to describe specific incidents of abuse, corroborating Tabitha's diary entries and providing prosecutors with a second witness to crimes that Josiah had believed would remain forever secret. Most damning was Caleb's revelation that Josiah had begun discussing plans to eliminate Tabitha once she had served her purpose, having grown concerned that her knowledge of his crimes made her a permanent threat to his reputation and freedom. Josiah said that once she quickened with child, there would be accidents that could befall a woman in her delicate condition, Caleb wrote, and that the Hollow had seen plenty of tragic deaths that nobody questioned because they trusted his word as a man of God. This confession letter provided Sheriff Brantley with the final piece of evidence needed to establish premeditated murder conspiracy, transforming what might have been prosecuted as domestic violence into capital murder charges that carried the death penalty. The community's wall of silence began crumbling as Sheriff Brantley's protection allowed witnesses to speak freely for the first time in years, revealing the true extent of Josiah's reign of terror and the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened his control over Blackstone Hollow. Justice for Tabitha Blackwood and the other victims would finally be within reach, but only if the collected evidence could survive the legal and political pressures that Josiah's wealth and influence could still command. With Caleb's confession letter providing the final piece of his evidentiary puzzle, Sheriff Brantley spent the first weeks of November 1879 methodically assembling a prosecutorial case that would leave no room for reasonable doubt or legal technicalities that might allow Josiah Blackwood to escape justice. The sheriff's investigation files, now comprising 6 leather-bound volumes totaling over 400 pages of testimony, physical evidence, and forensic documentation, represented the most thorough criminal investigation in Morgan County history. Court records reveal that Brantley had cataloged 47 separate pieces of physical evidence, including blood-stained clothing, medical instruments used in examinations, photographs of crime scenes, and handwriting samples that established clear chains of custody for every item that would be presented to the jury. The breakthrough that transformed the case from circumstantial evidence to ironclad prosecution came when Tabitha Blackwood, devastated by Caleb's death but finally freed from his potential retaliation, agreed to provide comprehensive testimony about her 18-month ordeal of systematic abuse and terror. Sheriff Brantley's interview notes, recorded over 3 days in the safety of the county courthouse, documented testimony so disturbing that the sheriff required frequent breaks to compose himself before continuing with questions that revealed the true depths of Josiah's depravity. Tabitha's sworn statement, running to 23 pages of handwritten testimony, provided prosecutors with detailed accounts of forced encounters, explicit death threats, and Josiah's planning for her eventual murder once she had served her purpose as a breeding vessel. He told me that producing a Blackwood heir was my only value as a wife, Tabitha testified, her voice recorded in Sheriff Brantley's careful handwriting, and that if I failed to quicken with Caleb's seed, he would bury me in the mine where nobody would ever find my body, just like he had done with others who disappointed him. Her testimony included specific details about the locations where abuse occurred, the times and dates of forced encounters, and Josiah's systematic destruction of her personal belongings to eliminate any sense of individual identity beyond her function as a vessel for continuing his bloodline. Most damning were her accounts of Josiah's detailed explanations of how previous accidents had befallen those who threatened his interests, including his first wife Mary and the minors who had died under suspicious circumstances. The physical evidence corroborating Tabitha's testimony filled an entire room in the courthouse basement, carefully cataloged and preserved according to Sheriff Brantley's military-trained evidence protocols that ensured admissibility in court proceedings. Ada Pruitt's collection of blood-stained sheets and torn clothing provided forensic proof of the violence Tabitha described, while Dr. Cross's hidden medical files contained photographic documentation of injuries that perfectly matched her accounts of specific beatings and assaults. Most compelling was the discovery of a wooden box buried beneath the Blackwood house's floorboards, containing what Josiah had apparently kept as trophies from his various victims, including jewelry that belonged to his deceased first wife and personal items taken from the miners who had died in accidents. Sheriff Brantley's decision to arrest Josiah Blackwood came on November 15, 1879, timed to coincide with the mine's shift change, when the maximum number of workers would witness the arrest and understand that their reign of terror had finally ended. The sheriff's report describes arriving at the mine entrance with 4 deputized assistants, finding Josiah supervising the loading of coal cars while completely unaware that his carefully constructed facade of respectability was about to crumble before the eyes of men he had terrorized for years. Court records show that Josiah's initial reaction to the arrest warrant was not surprise or denial, but rather indignant outrage that anyone would dare challenge his authority over what he considered his personal property and family matters. "You have no right to interfere in how a man disciplines his wife or manages his household," Josiah declared to Sheriff Brantley in front of 40 witnesses, his statement carefully recorded in the arrest report that would later be read to the jury during trial proceedings. "A man's got the right to ensure his bloodline continues by any means necessary. That's God's law and mountain law, and no government official has authority to override divine commandment." This public admission of guilt, witnessed by miners who had lived in fear of Josiah's retaliation for years, provided prosecutors with additional evidence while demonstrating the complete absence of remorse that would influence the jury's ultimate verdict regarding appropriate punishment. The arrest scene revealed Josiah's true character as his carefully maintained mask of Christian respectability dissolved into rage and threats against anyone who had dared to testify against him. Sheriff Brantley's report documented Josiah's specific promises of violent retaliation against Ada Pruitt, Thomas Mackenzie, and other witnesses, including detailed descriptions of how he planned to deal with troublemakers once he regained his freedom through legal proceedings. These threats, made in the presence of multiple witnesses and recorded in official law enforcement documents, provided additional charges of witness intimidation while demonstrating the ongoing danger that Josiah posed to anyone who had contributed to his prosecution. The community's transformation following Josiah's arrest was immediate and dramatic, as years of suppressed fear and resentment erupted into a flood of testimony from residents who had previously been too terrified to speak openly about the suspicious deaths and systematic intimidation that had characterized life in Blackstone Hollow. Sheriff Brantley's supplementary investigation files reveal that over 30 additional witnesses came forward in the week following the arrest, providing corroborating testimony about Josiah's threats, violent behavior, and the climate of fear that had prevented earlier disclosure of his crimes. These testimonies painted a comprehensive picture of a community held hostage by economic dependence and physical intimidation, where speaking against Josiah Blackwood had meant risking employment, housing, credit, and ultimately life itself. Among the most damaging new testimony was that of Reverend Silas Morton, whose initial reluctance to speak against a fellow church member dissolved once Josiah's arrest demonstrated that justice was finally possible. The Reverend's testimony revealed years of increasingly disturbing theological discussions where Josiah had twisted biblical passages to justify his obsession with bloodline purity and his treatment of women as property rather than human beings created in God's image. Court records show that Reverend Morton had maintained detailed notes of these conversations, initially intending to counsel Josiah away from heretical interpretations, but ultimately creating a documented record of premeditated criminal conspiracy disguised as religious conviction. The evidence collection phase concluded with Sheriff Brantley's exhumation and forensic examination of Mary Blackwood's remains, which revealed definitive proof that Josiah's first wife had been murdered rather than dying in childbirth as officially recorded. State medical examiners found skull fractures consistent with repeated blunt force trauma, injuries to her hands indicating desperate attempts at self-defense, and complete absence of any evidence suggesting recent pregnancy or childbirth complications. These forensic findings established Josiah's pattern of murdering wives who failed to produce heirs, transforming the charges against him from domestic violence and conspiracy to multiple counts of premeditated murder that carried mandatory death sentences under Kentucky law. The mountain of evidence assembled by Sheriff Brantley's investigation represented more than just the documentation necessary for successful prosecution. It stood as testament to the courage of witnesses who had risked everything to ensure that justice would finally reach Blackstone Hollow. With 47 pieces of physical evidence, 63 witness testimonies, complete medical documentation, and forensic proof of multiple murders, the case against Josiah Blackwood was unassailable. The community that had lived in terror for years would finally see their tormentor face the full consequences of his crimes, as the machinery of justice prepared to deliver the verdict that evil could not hide forever behind respectability and religious pretense. The trial of Josiah Blackwood began on February 23, 1880, in the Morgan County Courthouse, where Judge Harrison Whitmore presided over proceedings that would establish legal precedent for prosecuting domestic violence and marital coercion throughout Kentucky. Court transcripts reveal that the prosecution's presentation of evidence required 6 full days, with 47 pieces of physical evidence displayed before a jury of 12 mountain men who had never encountered such systematic documentation of evil disguised as Christian duty. Sheriff Brantley's testimony alone consumed 8 hours, as he methodically presented investigation files that chronicled 2 years of meticulous evidence gathering and witness protection that had finally broken through the wall of silence surrounding Josiah's crimes. Tabitha Blackwood's testimony on March 2nd represented the first time in Kentucky legal history that a woman had been permitted to provide detailed court testimony about systematic marital abuse, her courage in facing her tormentor establishing precedent that would be cited in domestic violence cases for decades to come. Court records show that her testimony required frequent recesses as she described 18 months of forced encounters with Caleb, explicit death threats, and Josiah's detailed planning for her eventual murder once she had served her purpose as a vessel for continuing his bloodline. The jury's visible shock during her testimony was noted by newspaper reporters who described grown men weeping as she recounted specific incidents of violence that had left her permanently scarred, both physically and emotionally. The prosecution's presentation of Dr. Cross's hidden medical files provided forensic corroboration for every aspect of Tabitha's testimony, with state medical expert Dr. Marcus Webb explaining to the jury how the documented injuries could only have resulted from systematic torture rather than accidental household mishaps. The physician's professional analysis of bite marks, burn patterns, and internal trauma painted a clinical picture of deliberate cruelty that contradicted any claim of religious discipline or biblical correction, establishing beyond reasonable doubt that Josiah's actions represented premeditated assault designed to break his victim's will through terror and pain. Most damaging was Dr. Webb's testimony that the pattern of injuries indicated escalating violence that would inevitably have resulted in Tabitha's death if the abuse had continued unchecked. Josiah's defense attorney, imported from Lexington at considerable expense, attempted to frame the charges as government interference in sacred family matters protected by religious freedom and traditional mountain customs regarding spousal discipline. Court transcripts reveal the defense's argument that Josiah's actions represented legitimate attempts to ensure biological continuation of his family line through methods sanctioned by biblical precedent and historical practice among isolated communities where bloodline preservation justified extraordinary measures. This legal strategy collapsed when Reverend Silas Morton testified that no legitimate Christian doctrine supported forced adultery or systematic torture, effectively destroying any claim that Josiah's crimes had religious justification. The jury's deliberation lasted only 47 minutes, returning guilty verdicts on all charges including first-degree murder of Dr. Cross, aggravated assault of Tabitha Blackwood, conspiracy in Caleb's death, and witness intimidation of community members who had attempted to expose his crimes. Judge Whitmore's sentencing statement, preserved in complete court records, declared that no law, divine or earthly, grants any man license for such abominations against human dignity and divine creation, and this court finds that the defendant's actions represent evil of such magnitude that only the ultimate penalty can serve justice and protect society from further depravity. The death sentence was imposed with the judge's additional observation that Josiah's complete lack of remorse demonstrated his continued danger to any community that might harbor him. The execution of Josiah Blackwood on March 15, 1880, drew over 200 witnesses to the Morgan County Courthouse Square, including many residents of Blackstone Hollow who had traveled specifically to witness the final destruction of the man who had terrorized their community for years. Sheriff Brantley's official execution report documented that Josiah maintained his defiant attitude until the end, using his final words not for confession or apology, but to declare that a man has the right to do what's necessary to preserve his bloodline, and no earthly court has authority to judge actions mandated by divine law. This complete absence of remorse, witnessed by hundreds of community members, vindicated the jury's decision and demonstrated that Josiah's evil had been irredeemable rather than correctable through lesser punishment. Tabitha's inheritance of the Blackwood properties, totaling 800 acres of mineral-rich mountain territory worth approximately $15,000, provided her with the financial independence necessary to escape the hollow and establish a new life free from the memories that haunted every familiar location. Court records show that she sold the entire estate within 6 months of Josiah's execution, using the proceeds to establish the Tabitha Cross Memorial Fund for Abused Women, named in honor of the physician who had died trying to protect her from her husband's violence. This fund, administered through the Louisville Women's Charitable Society, provided shelter and legal assistance to domestic violence victims throughout Kentucky for over 30 years. The physical evidence from the trial was preserved in the Kentucky State Archives, where Tabitha's diary, Dr. Cross's medical files, and Sheriff Brantley's investigation records remain accessible to researchers studying early domestic violence prosecution and women's rights advocacy. The sealed Blackwood mine, abandoned after Josiah's execution when no workers would agree to enter shafts where multiple murders had occurred, stands as a permanent monument to the evil that had been exposed and destroyed through the persistence of investigators who refused to accept that wealth and respectability could shield criminal behavior from justice. Most significantly, Tabitha's courageous testimony established legal precedent that marital status provided no protection for systematic abuse. With her case cited in Kentucky, appellate decisions well into the 20th century. The bloodline that Josiah had killed to preserve died with him on the gallows, as he left no legitimate heirs, and his family name became synonymous with evil rather than respected mountain heritage. The Blackwood properties were eventually developed by outside investors who erected a Methodist church on the site of the former family home, with a memorial plaque honoring Dr. Cross and the other victims of Josiah's reign of terror. Blackstone Hollow transformed from a community paralyzed by fear into a thriving settlement where residents could speak freely and seek justice without fear of economic retaliation or physical violence. The documented evidence preserved in state archives ensures that the truth about Josiah Blackwood's crimes will never be forgotten or minimized, serving as permanent testimony that evil cannot hide forever when good people refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice. Justice had not only been served but had established lasting protections for future victims, transforming individual tragedy into social progress that honored the courage of those who had sacrificed everything to expose the truth.